Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm joined again tonight by Peter Dickinson. He is with the Atlantic Council editor, the Ukrainian alert editor at the Atlantic Council. We've chatted with him about Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine before, and I thought it'd be good to check in with him because he's recently done a series on Kyiv versus Kiev. Peter Dickinson, welcome to the show, sir.
Hi, good to join you.
Great to see you again. Are you still in Kyiv?
Yes.
And how's life?
Life in Kiev is good. It's fairly normal, if I may say so. Of course, there's a sort of backdrop of tension and trauma, but life here is fairly stable, fairly normal, with its usual ups and downs. We are anticipating a very difficult winter. There are expectations that we'll have a serious bombing campaign from Russia, as we had last year, which will target the civilian infrastructure, so the energy systems, and possibly also water, electricity, other power, other core infrastructure. But that is part of that's part of the bigger war. Of course, that's part of the reality that people here live with. So generally speaking, Kiev is pretty vibrant these days.
You posted recently about the challenges if Russia ever won to the world and democracy. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I think that's a key issue now. Of course, we've had the last 4 months really of Ukraine's much anticipated counteroffensive has really failed to produce the results that people were hoping for. They've not been able to replicate the very big success that Ukraine had in the second half of last year. And so, of course, some people now are starting to question, where's this going? Can we expect there to be any real progress? And is it now time to say, okay, let's cut our losses, or let's reach a compromise, or let's accept that we can't have the victory that people were previously hoping for? And it's a very dangerous, a very slippery slope, because if we were to accept some form of compromise with the Russians, that would mean essentially, by almost any format of compromise, would be conceding land to Russia, to give Russia land, to allow Vladimir Putin's invasion to succeed. It would vindicate him. It would vindicate what he's done in Ukraine. It would vindicate all of the fundamental breaches of international law, the mass murders, the ethnic cleansing, etc. And that would have huge repercussions, not just for Ukraine, but for the international community.
Why?
Of course, Ukrainians would suffer. Sorry?
Why do you think it's so wider? And, lots of people have talked about it, but I want to hear your point of view. Why is this an issue for the Western world and for democracy?
Well, I think, first of all, it's the immediate consequences would be from Russia itself. So Russia, of course, would, if Russia were able to gain, confirm its grip over parts of Ukraine, or even to take over the whole of Ukraine, there would be a major escalation in the war crimes we're already seeing here. So that would have obvious dire consequences for the Ukrainian population. And also that would lead to a massive wave of migrants, refugees into the European Union, far larger than we saw in 2022. Perhaps tens of millions of people. So that would have major consequences there in a practical sense for the European Union. Russia would also seek to go further. I think there's no real doubt that if Putin were successful in Ukraine, he would then turn his attention to other countries of the former Soviet Union first and foremost. So that would be, I think, realistically, Moldova would be the first target. He would also look to the South Caucasus region, that's Armenia and Georgia primarily. He would turn to Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and other countries in Central Asia would become immediately very, very, very much at risk. And then beyond that, the fall of Ukraine would very much discredit NATO as an organization. And Putin would look to push that further. He would look to attack further. He would look to test NATO, probably in the Baltic states, in the Baltic regions. And then we would have a scenario, maybe in a year, maybe in 2 years, where people in America, people in Canada, in Britain, in France are being asked, okay, are we going to go to war with Russia over a border town in Estonia or Latvia? Are we going to risk World War III over Narva, for example, a town in Estonia? And if they said no or hesitated or were demoralized by what had already happened in Ukraine, then NATO itself becomes questionable. Is it viable? The whole basis of NATO is Article 5, is the idea that attack on one is an attack on all. It is a defensive alliance. It is attractive to its members because it offers guarantees of security. If you take that away, it's meaningless, really. It's not what the whole purpose of the alliance fades. So we would be in a situation quite quickly, within a few years, I think, where the entire architecture of the post-Cold War era and perhaps even the post-World War II era, the security architecture, the international relations architecture of the world would collapse. And we'd find ourselves in a world where it was very much might is right, where it's dog eat dog, where powerful neighbors can openly bully their weaker neighbors. And the consequences would be desperate. We're talking about massive militarization, closed borders, collapsing global trade. So the economic costs would be huge. The opportunity costs on government spending in all Western countries would be huge, because if you increase your military spending by however many percentage points, then of course you decrease other spending. And if your trade balance, if your trade is going down, if your economy is suffering, then the pot gets smaller. So we'd be looking at a much poorer world, a much more detached world, a much less connected world, and a much more fearful world. And there would be wars going off quite regularly around the world. It would be a return to the sort of 18th century, perhaps early 19th century scenario, of course, but with modern weapons.
Peter, I agree with you completely, but a lot of people don't. You've got, huge parts of the Republican Party in the United States and lots of people elsewhere around the world that don't think that we should continue funding Ukraine, that don't believe that you're right, that it's an attack against freedom and democracy internationally. It's just an attack against Ukraine. And they're willing to give up portions of Ukraine, if not, frankly, all of Ukraine. How would you respond to them?
Well, this argument about the costs of Ukraine, I think it's very cheap. This is perhaps the most frustrating aspect of this debate. Of course, people living in a peaceful environment are inclined to say, I am prepared to sacrifice you in order to maintain my peace. Unfortunately, that's human nature, and I think there's an element of that in all of us. I wouldn't want to be too judgmental of the people who make these arguments. I think many of them do it in good faith. Many of them do think it's not their problem, and they will have a rude awakening if this comes to pass. So if you don't like the costs of supporting Ukraine, then wait till you see the cost of a Russian victory and containing Russia after it's victorious in Ukraine. The cost will be astronomical. But unfortunately, all you can do is continue to explain this to them, to highlight what's going on. And I think issues like what we're seeing now with Hamas attacking Israel and Russia quite openly siding with Hamas and Iran in that factor, we're seeing that there are consequences for not dealing with this sort of authoritarian aggression. There are consequences. It emboldens these forces. And you see very clearly, I think if the West had responded forcefully to the invasion of Ukraine 18 months ago, 20 months ago, then you wouldn't have seen what we've recently seen in Israel, for example. And of course, then
really, you think that there's a connection between a less than stellar response to the Russian invasion has caused what, an attitude that violence is okay?
It's caused a sense of impunity that you can try these things, that the West is indecisive. I think the West has clearly shown that it's not decisive over Ukraine. Now, again, I don't want to be totally dismissive of what the West done? I think that would be, absolutely incorrect. The West has done a lot. The aid that's been provided to Ukraine has been very important. It's allowed Ukraine to survive, first and foremost, which is no small thing, of course. Russia holds 20% of Ukraine. If the West had not provided the aid they have, Russia would probably control 100% of Ukraine, and the death toll would be not in the hundreds of thousands, but would be in the millions. So it is a very significant level of support the West has provided. But even so, we are seeing, and this will, I'm sure everyone recognizes, every time that we discuss weapons deliveries to Ukraine, there are delays, there are long debates, there is hesitation, there is an excess of caution. Every time that someone like Russia sees this, they're emboldened. They think, the West is weak, we push further. This is why you see Russia engaging in nuclear blackmail, in threats, in intimidation tactics. They know that they can intimidate the West to step back and to be cautious, to be far more cautious than they should or would necessarily be otherwise. And I think actors like Hamas certainly see that. Certainly the Iranians see that, and they will push further. These are regimes that are fundamentally in opposition to the current world order. They don't think it's a just world order. They want to change that world order. They do not recognize the sort of Western imposed, as they see it, way of doing business internationally, and they wish to change that, and they will do anything to undermine it. So you see these countries coming together now, coalescing. You see recently, just in Moscow, you see Hamas in Moscow being welcomed officially in the Kremlin, together with Iran. Now, no country in the Western world would consider engaging directly with Hamas after what they did in Israel on October the 7th. And that is clear that they were already a prior organization, a prescribed organization. But Russia openly welcomes them because they see that there is a common ground there of an anti-Western coalition. We shouldn't underestimate that. They have different aims, of course. They have different goals. Hamas is very clearly intent on the destruction of Israel. Russia is very focused on the destruction of Ukraine. But fundamentally, they are anti-Western. And when the West is weak, they're emboldened. That's inevitable.
Two of the recent posts that you've put are: army in Ukraine is cheap compared to the far higher price of a Russian victory. And the enemies of democracy are testing us. This is why war in Ukraine was never just a war against Ukraine. However, leaders of the Western world just now starting to think about it. Might be too late. Peter, it's great to chat with you. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Peter Dickinson of the Atlantic Council, coming to us from Kyiv, Ukraine today. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest is Peter Dickinson. He's the editor for the Atlantic Council in Ukraine. He's coming to us today from Kyiv, Ukraine, and he's just given us a review of why he thinks Ukraine is so critically important to the West as a bolster, as a wall against Soviet expansion, against Russian expansion, and why it's so important that we are successful in Ukraine. Peter, let's take a step back, if we could, and talk about what's happening on the ground. So, please update us. What's happening in the south of Ukraine? Is this the chance of cutting off the land bridge to Crimea? Are these new munitions that are coming from the United States, these cluster bombs, this artillery? What do you think? What do you hear? How do you feel things are progressing?
Well, there's a lot of action around the front line in Ukraine. The front line is now approximately about 600 or 700 miles in length, so it's a very, very large conflict zone, and there's a lot of different things taking place. But the line of contact itself is fairly static. It's not a stalemate. It's wrong to talk about the war in terms of a stalemate. There's a lot of dynamic movement going on, and frankly, a lot of bloodshed, a lot of losses on both sides. But the line itself is fairly static because it's a very defensive. The situation, the circumstances of the war now favor largely the defenders. Russia was able over the last winter, so from November last year through to the spring of this year, Russia had a period of relative calm, which they used to build a very sophisticated line of fortifications and entrenchments across southern Ukraine, eastern Ukraine as well, but mostly southern Ukraine, to defend the so-called land bridge which links Russia to Crimea. That has proven a very tough nut to crack. The Ukrainian forces have been fighting there with their own counteroffensive since June, so it's now it's in its the 5th month now, and they've made very little progress. There's been some progress, but it's been literally in terms of a few miles here and there, some minor penetrations. There's been no breakthroughs, and they have suffered significant losses. So they're simply struggling to get through these defences. We're talking about very, very well entrenched positions, which are defended by wide minefields. So they're very difficult physically to get to. And then also Russia has air superiority, so they're able to fire at Ukraine attacking if Ukraine uses armor to assault. And they have heavy artillery presence there. So it's proven almost impossible so far for Ukraine to break through on the south. Now in the east, we have Ukraine fighting on the offensive around the Bakhmut area, which was a big battle earlier this year, which Russia took that city. Now Ukraine is fighting back and threatening to encircle that city. And then further to the north again, you have Russia launching its own counteroffensive, and they're also making progress. They're looking to encircle and take the city of Avdiivka before the winter sets in. Again, they're making some progress, very heavy losses, but it's slow and it's small. We're talking about, advances that are measured in meters rather than miles or regions. So it's a very brutal at the moment offensive on both sides. There's not a lot of progress. The parallels to World War I would say, are pretty obvious and pretty grim. But at the same time, there's a lot happening away from the front lines. You've got, for example, I think the most important theatre is Crimea and the Black Sea. In recent months, Ukraine has launched a wide range of very surgical strikes in Crimea, taking out the air defences, taking out key port installations, and then finally hitting the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which is based in Crimea, in the port of Sevastopol. They destroyed a number of major ships and a submarine in Sevastopol, which were in dock at the time, with British-supplied Storm Shadow cruise missiles. And they've also launched a number of commando raids into Crimea, into the region. This combined, this kind of Crimean offensive has succeeded in forcing the Russians to withdraw the vast majority of their warships, their fleet, from Crimea to ports in Russia itself. And Russia is actually setting up a new port for its Black Sea forces in the occupied parts of Georgia in the east of the Black Sea, so as far away from Ukraine as they could possibly get. So this war began in Crimea in 2014, and the whole argument at the time was to protect the Black Sea fleet. Ukraine in recent months has essentially forced the fleet to retreat. They've pulled out to the east of Ukraine, to the east of the Black Sea, and Ukraine has been able to. That keeps Ukraine a little bit safer, not hugely, but a little bit safer. It also gives Ukraine more room to navigate the Black Sea for Ukraine's merchant shipping and international merchant shipping to traverse the Black Sea and to come to Ukraine. And Ukraine has been able to break the blockade of its ports. So there's movement going on around around the wider war zone, not only along the front lines, but the front lines itself are from a Ukrainian perspective, certainly offer a very sobering, I would say, image.
We've heard about marine drones and attacks on this big bridge that was critical to Putin's sort of ego. Tell us about those, if you could.
Yeah, well, the Crimean Bridge is a symbol of Russia's war against Ukraine. The invasion of Ukraine began in spring 2014 with the seizure of Crimea, which was a brilliant operation, a lightning operation, which took the entire world by surprise. Russia used the troops it already had in Crimea and brought in additional forces and seized the peninsula with very little opposition within the space of a couple of days. They then held a fig leaf referendum to try and add some legitimacy to the occupation, and have occupied Crimea ever since. So that's almost 10 years. That will be 10 years next February. So within a few months, and the success of Crimea is the basis for the whole war that we've seen since. Again, the issue I was raising earlier, the international community did not respond forcefully to the seizure of Crimea in 2014. Therefore, Putin drew the obvious conclusion, well, I'm going to go further. And he did go further. He went into mainland Ukraine. So the bridge that was built from Russia to Crimea was very much a symbol of the permanency of Russia's occupation. It was Russia saying to the Russian public, to Ukraine, and to the world, we are here forever. This is now part of Russia. And the bridge was kind of a link, a chain saying, this is our territory. We're taking this territory for long term. So, of course, it's been a target for Ukraine now. Ukraine hit the bridge the first time last October and disabled it partially. They've hit it again since then and again caused some partial disruption. But the expectation is now that Ukraine, it's thought that Ukraine probably now has the potential to fully destroy the bridge, or certainly break the communications on the bridge. But they are now waiting for the opportune moment. Ukraine has recently received new missiles from the West, from America, the so-called ATACMS, the ATACMS, longer range missiles. So the expectation is that, if we're not sure exactly if they have them yet or not, but they've already received some and they've used them very effectively. The expectation is that they will take the bridge down at the opportune moment as the attack on Crimea escalates. The marine drones that you mentioned are a separate issue, really. They have been a very effective tool in the attacks on Russian shipping. Ukraine has a very, very dynamic military defense tech sector. A lot of Ukraine's, for many years, Ukraine's had a very, very vibrant IT industry, a tech industry. And a lot of the people from that sector have sort of come across to the military side since the full-scale invasion began in 2022. And they are producing some very interesting kits of very, very, very clever tools. One of them that they've developed is these marine drones, which they've christened them the Sea Babies, and they have proven a very effective tool against Russian shipping. They've managed to hit a number of warships and other Russian shipping, and again force Russia to move away from Ukraine in the Black Sea to ease the blockade, because Russia was blockading Ukraine's ports since the weeks before the war began, before the full-scale invasion, so from January 2022. They've now managed to push them back because it's too dangerous for these Russian ships to act in the Black Sea. I think what we're seeing with the drones is the future of warfare. We're seeing drones on land in Ukraine, of course, itself, all along the battlefront, in Russia as well. But the Black Sea, I think, is where they've been most effective.
Let's change to the business environment. You posted that something like 84% of businesses are back operational as part of the American Ukraine Chamber of Commerce. Tell me what's happening from a business standpoint.
Yeah, the business community, I mean, that's, of course, operational where possible in terms of, where they're physically able to be. Of course, businesses in the occupied parts of Ukraine are not operational. Businesses along the front lines are not operational. So there's a lot that aren't. But those that are not physically prevented from operating by the immediate presence of the war are largely operational. I run a business magazine in Ukraine and have done for many years, and we're preparing an issue now. We've just published a month ago our first issue of the wartime period, and frankly, it was very successful. There was a lot of engagement from the community, the business community. People were very eager to engage, and that is always a very strong sign, because when crises hit, the first thing people cut is their marketing budget, is their communications budgets. So that was a very encouraging indication from me as a publisher, of course, but from a broader perspective in terms of where the economy is now and where Ukraine is going. I mean, I wouldn't want to overstate it. Of course, the economy's been absolutely hammered by this war, and the situation is not good by any stretch of the imagination. But the creativity, the resilience, the adaptability that Ukrainian businesses have shown has been remarkable, and they've managed to adapt and rework their business models to get around many of the logistical problems, the supply problems, the market loss, the loss of market access, and the physical problems of exporting. You know, with the Black Sea ports under blockade, that was a huge issue for Ukraine. They've had to switch around to land, using the EU borders by land, trucking, using trains. It's been really remarkable to see how they've been able to do that in ways that have, kept the economy ticking over. And the Ukrainian economy is expected to grow this year. Now, it's growing from a very low base, of course, because it fell heavily last year, of course. But nevertheless, it is growing, and it's expected to grow this year, and expected to grow further next year. So that speaks for itself, I think.
Peter, a lot of people can't imagine, you sitting in your office and working in the middle of a war zone. Tell me what life is like for you.
Yeah, I mean, there is a surreal element to it sometimes. I do find that sometimes for myself, even I have to pinch myself sometimes and think. I mean, I think, it is a reminder. The experience of the past 20 months here in Ukraine is a reminder that life goes on. That people will find a way. They will find a way of making things work. I mean, my day-to-day life is not really that different to the pre-war period. I think partly because I live outside of the city. I have my own, we have our own power source here and our own water supplies at home. If there are power cuts, which we had a lot last winter, we haven't had many of them actually in recent months, but that was certainly a factor last winter. We expect that to be a factor again this winter, again because we expect Russia to resume its large-scale bombing of the country's infrastructure. But beyond that, the only major real differences to day-to-day life would be, you have air raids. So if you're in the city, you may have an air raid. You may have to abandon an event you're attending, for example, or you may have to leave a shop you're in. We have curfews. So late at night, if you're out in the city in the evening, say at a business event or meeting friends or attending some sort of an event, you have to factor in you need to get home before the curfew finishes. Again, as I live outside Kiev, I have to leave early because I have to get out, and I know the taxi driver has to get back before the curfew is imposed. But even that is not a major issue. I mean, of course, it means you can't stay out all night, but that's not a huge issue for me personally. The curfew in the early months of the war was 10 p.m. So that was quite a restriction. It meant that by 8 p.m., for example, you had to start thinking about how to get home. Now the curfew's been extended to midnight, so you can be out. I mean, I can be out in Kiev till 10:30 at night before I start making my way home, which is not a major imposition on me personally. So these are the realities of day-to-day life for me. But of course, for many millions of people in Ukraine, day-to-day life is unrecognizably more difficult. Those living near the front lines who are bombed on a daily basis, those who have had to flee their homes, those who are living under occupation, first and foremost. Millions of Ukrainians are currently, as we speak, living under Russian occupation, and the horrors that they are experiencing are beyond comprehension, frankly. I mean, it's absolutely chilling when you read accounts or meet people who've come from those regions, which I often do in Kiev, and learn about how what is going on there and what they're being exposed to. So it's a very mixed experience. What is going on here in my life here in Kiev is not necessarily representative of what's going on in Ukraine in general. Ukraine's a very large country. I mean, I think that's important to stress every time I'm engaging with the international media, because it's not necessarily appreciated. It's the biggest country in Europe. There's a lot of different realities in today's Ukraine. It's a large country with a large population, and so it varies very much where you are. It depends where you are.
Peter, really appreciate you joining us and updating us what's going on. As a final word, what would you like to say to the people of Toronto, the people of Canada?
First of all, I would extend my thanks, personal thanks, and I believe the thanks of Ukrainians for the support that Canada has offered and continues to offer to Ukraine. I think it's recognised and it's welcomed and it's very much appreciated. But the main message is, don't let this become normalised. Don't let what's happening in Ukraine today become a normalized process that's kind of accepted and allowed to continue. It is not normal, and it's a very, very big threat to the way that everybody, certainly in the Western world, lives today. If it is allowed to continue, if Russia is allowed to succeed, even partially, the ramifications for everybody in the Western world will be profound, and you will not like them. So don't let it get any worse than it already is. The good news is that Ukrainians are ready to fight this thing, and they will fight. They are fighting, and they will fight. All they need is the support of the West, in my opinion, and they will win. It's not going to be soon. It might not be it won't be this year. We hope it's next year. But I see no real weakening in Ukraine's resolve to win, to defend themselves. All they need is support. So my main message would be, please keep that support up. Please do so for Ukrainians, but do it for yourselves as well, because ultimately you will pay a price if Ukraine falls.
Peter Dickinson, Ukraine editor for the Atlantic Council. Thanks so much for joining us and updating us on what's going on in Ukraine. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to take a break and be back in 2 minutes with my own views on this issue. Stay with us, everybody.